Hi, my name is Rolf Agner, and welcome to On Air with SICK. In this season of our podcast, we're providing some valuable information on the use of autonomous mobile robots, or AMRs, in the manufacturing and material handling industries. Today on our show, I'm joined by Bryan Duncan, who will be my co-host. Bryan is the National Sales Manager for Retail Distribution at SICK. Bryan will be interviewing a special guest, John Hayes, the Vice President of Sales from Vecna Robotics. These two had a great conversation about the flexibility of AMRs for the retail and distribution markets and the return on investment you can see with this technology. This interview will be two parts, so join us next time to hear the second half of our interview with John. Take it away, Bryan.
This is Bryan Duncan with SICK, and I'm on the podcast today with John Hayes, who is the Vice President of Sales for Vecna Robotics. We're going to discuss several subjects, but really the application of mobile platforms in the supply chain, tilting heavily towards some of the retail logistics that we see. That would include AGVs, AGCs, and AMRs. So good morning, John. How you doing?
Hey, good morning, Bryan. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm doing quite well.
We're glad to do it. We look at Vecna as a really good partner, and we think that between the two of us, we try to stay on the leading edge of technology in the marketplace in this space, and we know that it's blowing up. We're excited about that. I know you are, and I know you've been in the mobile platform market for quite a few years. You and I both have.
I started in this industry, right out of the Marine Corps. So I guess that was 1992 or 3, and it's pretty much all I've done, and it has changed quite a bit over that time. It was certainly black magic back then. And the technology is certainly changing. It is changing in many ways because of the thing that you mentioned. The company that you work for and the sensors that you provide. The sensors are really what's changing how we can approach applications, especially some of the ones we're going to talk about in retail and grocery because of the ability to sense pallets and loads as well as safety. So yeah, let's talk a little bit about those things.
Well, from your perspective. And now AMRs are becoming a big part of the equation. It used to be AGV, AGC that still is a huge part of the market, of course. But AMRs are becoming more and more, I won't say desirable, but companies are looking at that type of technology more and more, and sometimes skipping over the guided vehicle portion of it. So from your perspective, if you look at mobile platforms, let's just call them all mobile platforms. What kind of roles do you see them playing right now in the retail distribution supply chain?
To back up just one step, because I think this is important, AGVs have been around for a very long time, and the concept of AMRs, conceptually, people think of them as a bot, so a very small piece of equipment that typically carries a tote or a bin. But the primary difference is the way that they navigate from location to location. So AGVs path follow, think line, magnet, laser, and AMR's path plan, using generally lasers or LiDAR or vision or some other system like that. But there's an overlap, and you're right, people are looking more to AMR now, but the concepts are much the same with respect to application suitability, except AMRs are certainly more flexible, and they don't become as obsolete as quickly as a purpose-built AGV does. Now, with that said, especially in retail and distribution in general, we see a lot of the world, I guess you'd say the Amazon effect, pushing picks down to the eaches. So, you're doing line item picks versus the old paradigms of bulk, which would be pallet moves, which AGVs are fantastic for. AMRs are especially good because of their size and their cost. They're much lower cost and lower cost to install. They're especially good for picking applications, and especially now in the world that we're living in today with this pandemic, you see retail and e-tail. I think that's how most of us are getting our goods to our homes. We're not going out like we used to. So, we're moving away from that bulk mindset in distribution, although it still exists. There are still fantastic applications for that, mostly tuggers and pallet jacks because of economies of scales. But we're seeing a lot of picking applications where people were walking through the warehouse, almost zone picking, and the AMRs are coming to the person, going to the location, telling the person what to pick, whether it's on the vehicle or whether it's on a wrist-mounted device. And it keeps a person more efficient in the warehouse, cuts down on the amount of walking that they have to do. So it's actually, I would say safer is probably not the right term, but it's definitely less work for a person over a day, the number of miles that they have to work, keeping them in a location and having the vehicles come to them. So we're seeing a lot more of that kind of concept. And it makes a lot of sense simply because, when you're talking about bulk picking, whether it's moving pallets around or the case pick solutions where, people are historically on a pallet jack and then they jump off, they grab the appropriate case, put it on a pallet, continue to do that over and over again until the pallet's full, then drive it somewhere, put it in a stretch wrapper, and then go get another empty pallet. The concepts of automating that have been around for quite some time where, you keep those folks in a zone and you let the vehicles navigate to those people. But, that market's growing, but only about 10%. And that's kind of the standard AGV market. The market for AMRs is just exploding. And it is exploding because of retail and because of those pick concepts. And it makes perfect sense because the number of picks that you have, the number of bots that you need, since you're moving totes versus a full pallet, is almost exponential, probably 10 to 1 bots per, traditional AGV. So we're seeing a lot of those. And the ROI is quite good because the systems are inexpensive. The bots are inexpensive.
Mm-hmm. Let's go back to this is interesting. You went to this. When we talk about the case picking applications, and that's typically found in grocery, right?
It is.
When one of the questions that's always come up about AMR versus either remote control guidance of a vehicle or straight up, the person, as you described, drives a vehicle, jumps off, picks, jumps back on. One of the questions that has come up is when you look at the pick metrics versus the two, can the pick rate on an AMR keep up with the traditional pick rate of just somebody driving the vehicle around? What is your observation on that, and what is your thought?
I've seen multiple applications for this recently, all pure distribution and picking, grocery. And can they keep up? The answer is yes, but the ROI is in some cases difficult to achieve with an AGV because of the cost of the vehicle. So we're concentrating now on case picking, which is the paradigm of a larger vehicle pulling or carrying an empty pallet where people will put a full case on. The reason that it makes viable sense in most cases is because you keep that picker efficient and the picker doesn't lose that 15 minutes of travel time from his last pick to the stretch wrapper, to an empty pallet, and then getting back in process to be able to move. Now, if you spent much time in grocery, which I know you have, generally they're working off of engineered rates, and they're working at rates that are just mind-blowing. You almost don't feel safe in those facilities, and when you walk around, generally you're with a safety person, and they'll tell you, look, don't get in these guys' ways because they're really cooking.
That's right.
The ROI from the travel time, which is what typically we get ROI from, so we would replace an AGV or an AMR, would replace a forklift, and you would, a certain quantity of AMRs or AGVs per forklift. It's not that same paradigm. The typical paradigm is keeping that person in more of a zone pick concept so that they can continue to pick when that vehicle disappears. So you've just cut out that 15 minutes of dwell time where they're not on their walkie pallet jack, taking the full pallet to the stretch wrapper, getting the empty. So that's where your incremental gains are. The math, though, becomes difficult because you do need more automated equipment. So even though you have less labor time working, you do need more automated equipment because you need to have the next vehicle there for the picker to continue to pick while the other vehicle travels back to the front of the facility. But it's a very good next step for automation. So if you were going to build a facility to do this today, you probably wouldn't use the same paradigm of storage and rack, replan to the floor, pick from floor locations. You would probably look for a different automated solution so that you don't have all the overlap of replan and picking. But it is a very good first step, and there is a good ROI but you just have to find the right applications for it. And with that said, there are simpler solutions that kind of bridge the gap. And I'm sure you're familiar with the follow me pick and those sorts of things where the vehicle travels along with the person, but the gains there are less simply because you still need to get on the vehicle to travel with the full pallet to the stretch wrapper to the empty pallet and get back in service, which means you don't continue to pick. Now, those systems are less expensive, but you have to make that value judgment. And I think the value judgment is changing, not necessarily for ROI any longer. And we see this all the time now. It's really changing because labor is very difficult to find and to keep in place. People are moving from one job to another because there's more money to be had at another location, let's just say.
Yeah,
so
just like down the street, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we see this all the time where another warehouse will come in and they'll pay, in some cases $1 more an hour. And I'm not sure about you, but $1 more an hour for most of us is a good bump in wage pay. Mm-hmm. So it makes total sense, and it becomes difficult to keep those folks. And with that said, you start to look at ways to offset the risk associated with being able to keep labor in-house. And it's not just a pure ROI any longer.
Do you think companies need to start looking at safety as part of the calculation? And let me give you an example. Large grocery retailers, they're typically paying their pickers on an incentivized plan. So basically, the more you pick, the more you get paid, right?
Exactly.
What that leads to is what you described as kind of a cowboy environment out in the DC. I mean, you've got to watch where you're walking out there, you get run over. And they also don't follow pick rules very well. We've seen these, like you said, the follow-along vehicles. They end up riding them a lot more than the internal pick rules really allow because of the incentive-based compensation. And I wonder if, and the safety of that is a big deal. So I wonder if that ever enters into the calculation yet for ROI.
It does. I never really paid an awful lot of attention to the monetary value of safety. There's obviously the intrinsic value of not hurting anyone in a facility. That's just obvious and common sense. But there is an ROI value, a monetary value associated with it with respect to insurance and those sorts of things that I have never used in any calculations. But I have had customers when we sit down and we talk and they go, no, absolutely. Our insurance rates go down in a company that's conglomerate that has, many locations. Mm-hmm. That's a big deal for them as well. Obviously, nobody wants anybody to get hurt, but there is also an ROI consideration with that. For many years, just wasn't even discussed. It didn't even make a bump in the ROI, but it does today.
I've seen snippets of that evolution too, and I hope it continues because it is an important factor and it's a real cost factor. So I'm with you. I hope more companies continue to consider that. Speaking of safety and AMRs, what do you think about the advent of these types of vehicles in the public or store environment?
So we're seeing a lot of that. Well, okay, so when I say we're seeing a lot of it, I am, but of course I'm more or less on the front lines of seeing this stuff on a daily basis. I don't think consumers are seeing a lot of it yet, but it's starting to roll out. The first real rollout that I saw that seemingly was pretty exciting because it establishes kind of that IIoT chain is for the inventory robots, so the shelf scanning inventory robots. The benefit there is the fact that they are still on the bot level, so they're small, they're light, for the most part intrinsically safe, and they're sensorized, so they're not going to hit you. But that was the first rollout, and that did have a defined ROI because retailers in general have a lot of shrinkage due to things that occur in their stores. Mm-hmm. That they can't account for. Whereas with this robot, they can continually monitor it. And then there's been a next step that has occurred after that. And so there's the first exciting step, which is the inventory side, which had a direct ROI impact. And then the next part was the ability for systems to deliver carts to store shelves. Now they don't necessarily replan them themselves, but they're programmed to leave the back of the store, the storage areas, with aisle-ready carts and they'll go to the appropriate location, and then a stocker doesn't have to push a cart. For all intent and purposes, it mirrors all of the concepts that we have done for ages in warehousing and distribution, but it's moving it out to the store floor. There's a definable benefit there because it allows, kind of a multiple robotic fleet to go to locations, and without having the labor associated, again, with walking back and forth and doing those things. It creates this definable tracking of inventory on the floor, ability to replan quickly, and the ability to know what's going on in the facility rather than just what in many cases seems like tribal knowledge. I need to go do this, or I need to go do that. We can monitor it. We can see what the trends are with respect to what's selling, shrinkage, and those sorts of things, and then address it with a piece of mobile equipment. And I think that in many cases, those are some jobs that people don't want to do anyway. So it's kind of a net positive all the way around. The growth offshoot of this, I think, is probably next steps. The ability for retailers to push product directly out to consumers from the back rather than having to have it on the floor. And again, this mirrors the concepts that you and I are familiar with of, whether it's an ASRS or a goods to person system. It mirrors those industrial concepts, but miniaturizes them, makes them safe. And by making them safe, in many cases, when we put this equipment into an industrial environment, we do weeks of training to make sure that people are safe around our equipment so that they don't do dumb things. The equipment is designed to be as safe as humanly possible, but you still have to, work around it in a safe fashion. When you put this equipment on a retail floor or in grocery or wherever you might put it around consumers, it ultimately has to be as safe as humanly possible around untrained people. And so we're there with this equipment, but to be able to deliver from the storeroom a picked bin or bag or box where you can order it on your phone, show up at the front of the store, and a robot can bring it to you, eliminates an awful lot of workload on the front side, as well as the one thing that they're not making anymore, which is real estate. So it is definitely occurring. And then the next step is, why not take it directly to your car? Now, there is guidance for that. So when we talk guidance, it's that first thing we talk about, AGV versus AMR and how they get from location to location. But it's not completely vetted at this point to be able to drive over curbs and stuff in the parking lot and those sorts of things. But it's coming. It's most certainly coming, where you could certainly drive up after placing an order in an app in your phone and have a vehicle come right to your car, and you could take a bin and put it right in your car, and away you go. So all those things are coming. And then you could go all the way down to the parcel folks, where they're talking about delivering with mobile robots in the city, or even drones. So is it coming? Absolutely. When we'll see it, I think we're still a ways out. Some of it is still in the very early phases, and there's an adoption that has to take place, and there still has to be an ROI. At the end of the day, somebody has to write a check, no matter how cool it is. But those first two that we talked about have a definable ROI, and the next steps, they will in the future as well.
Well, that's exactly what we're seeing from the retailers that we work with directly. Those two applications you discussed, the shelf scan and the I call it auto delivery from the back room for replenishment. We're also seeing them transfer that floor scrubbing technology over to the stores that we've been doing in the warehouses for a little while now. But then going on, taking your point out further, we've heard the exact same things. Eventually, we will have a robot that will deliver the goods to your car and maybe even put them in the trunk, right?
Right.
There are some technological barriers we have to overcome. That, like you said, you got to be able to travel outside across a curb and across a parking lot in the snow and in the heat. And so all those things, I think, are being worked on by people like you and I. But that will come one day, won't it? I don't know how long it's going to take, but it will come.
There are people who are thinking a long way down the road, trying to figure out what the next best thing is, but still trying to figure out how to keep the doors open. And so we're going to see these things happen. And it's just going to come down to, what pain are we feeling today and what do we want to offset in the future, I'm sure.
Well, that leads to another good question, though. I know right now you're heavily engaged with your customers during this period of time, and they don't want to stop planning, right? They may not have their operations open, or they may be open so much they can't really do much right now. Some of the grocery companies, they're at holiday levels right now. But when you're talking to these folks and remaining engaged, how do you keep the planning for budgets and for applications and projects out into the next year and the year after, when you're not really able to be in the facility right now?
Yeah, that's a tough one, but I think that it goes way back to something that was said earlier, and that is this used to be black magic, but it really isn't any longer. I think, the older fellas in the industry, like me, certainly not you, but certainly me, you start to see the forest and the trees, which means customers have a pain and they want to solve that issue. And what we're seeing mostly now are C-level and VP level that are approaching us and saying, what can we do? Exactly what you just said. What we're doing is doing for more or less a virtual audit. And it's really quite simple because there is no black magic with what we do, even though the applications certainly have changed. The sensor technology, the guidance technology, AMR technology versus AGV technology. At the end of the day, it's really as simple as moving something from point A to point B automatically every single day. So I can sit with someone and understand what they need. I mean, you and I have seen thousands of applications and probably many more facilities, and kind of understand the concept of what they're trying to achieve, and then bread box it for them. So we spend some time just on the phone. Generally, if it gets past that bread box concept, we'll get an AutoCAD file to determine space and those things. But it's really quite simple if you boil it down to that initial concept of, we're really just moving product in a facility. Take the technology away from it. Now, I know that it's the cool part of what we do, but if you go all the way back to the nuts and bolts, blocking and tackling of what we do, it's really distance divided by speed, whether I'm picking up from the floor, going into a rack, or how many pallets I need to move per hour, and then coming up with an application suitability. Will it work or won't it work? You need to find someone who is, going to shoot it to you straight at that point. That's really where the rubber meets the road. Is this something that makes sense? And if the answer is yes, then we'll bread box it and come up with a solution, a number of vehicles or a concept, and then put some sort of rough order of magnitude number on it. And what that allows, customers to do in the short term, planning for the long term, is to keep those budgets alive, because they still need to plan for next year. If we don't plan for next year, both our companies are going to be in trouble, not yours and mine, but the customer's company and my company. Mm-hmm. So you need to keep your budgets alive with concepts that will save money, make you more efficient, as well as possibly stave off, the problems that we're seeing today. It's our goal to help them, at least in the simplest way possible, to continue down that road. But I think the key is it's just not black magic. It's still pretty simple applications, even the ones that are cloud-based, and we talked about IIoT. Those are all means to an end of still just moving product from point A to point B.
Well, that's all for today's episode of On Air with SICK. Thanks for listening, and thank you to Bryan Duncan for joining me today, along with John Hayes for providing his insight on AMRs in the retail market. Join us again next time for part 2 of this interview, where Bryan and John will discuss how to use AMRs in public settings and keep people safe. If you ever want more information on anything we talk about in this podcast, send us an email at info@sick.com. Until next time, I am Rolf Agner, and this has been On Air with SICK.